there could be a whole department of study at a university around this, but you touch at something that I think is very important. You talk about like Mesopotamia, for example, was an arid land. And there's a lot more history in arid lands than people claim to. And so as you were talking about like the East Coast and the Southwest, I would argue, as you said that, I was like, oh, the Southwest is going to win this game. Because you look at the movement of people, you look at the development of capitalism, things like that. The Southwest is the best form of that in America today, I would say. Now, I'm biased, I live here, but I say that because I was thinking a lot about that paradigm. I want to shift a little bit, though, because, again, another paradigm that you said, you were telling kind of the history of planting here and developing the agriculture and the canals. And you quote a line that they used at the time, which was rainfall follows the plow. Okay, which, by the way, if I was going to give you a theme of what I've seen in Arizona, like you mentioned, that was an ADOT publication, Arizona Highways. Rainfall follows the plow. So what are they plowing? They're plowing pictures and storytelling of Arizona. What happens? Rainfall is people show up eventually. And when you said that, I mean, that is such a true paradigm for what we've witnessed here, where this isn't just like, oh, it randomly happened. No, there was plowing going on in advance of this. And I would say, is that something you think of as you think across the Southwest, or what I took away from your writing is that's more dominantly true from what we've seen in Las Vegas and Phoenix, hence why the growth has been so much stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love you taking that quote and kind of thinking of it beyond agriculture, because it's absolutely the case that at the same time that Carlson is editing Arizona Highways, he's buddies with the Goldwater family, with Dwight Hurd, with Del Webb, this whole class.
Bimson was in there too.
Yeah, Walter Bimson, the chairman of Valley National Bank, that like all of these businessmen who are basically making the land fertile for development by offering tax breaks, by recruiting companies to come, like mostly aerospace and technology. And so like they outcompeted the rest of the region. Yeah. And El Paso actually, El Paso once upon a time was sort of the leading economic center of the Southwest, mostly because of the railroads and its proximity to Mexico. And in the 70s, they commissioned a study that's basically like, wait, how did Phoenix surpass us? Like, how did we lose? And I think it is very much that they didn't have that kind of forward-thinking vision and this idea that we can kind of fill this valley up if we like orient ourselves right. And I think Las Vegas does the exact same thing. I mean, Las Vegas is the only one of these cities where there's no real indigenous history. I mean, people's like, were nomadic and would stop there for water from the like springs, but there's no kind of settlement there. When the Mormons are first coming to the West, they send a party to settle and they abandon the Las Vegas Valley after a year, and they call it the land the Lord has forgotten. Yeah. It was like so sort of hostile. But with Las Vegas, between the railroad coming in and then especially the Hoover Dam being built, and suddenly you have the largest reservoir in the country next door, there was that opportunity again to kind of build something out of nothing, which to me is like the definitive Southwest act. And they just follow the blueprint of Phoenix, except replace, agriculture and aerospace with gambling, but it's the exact same playbook. Yeah, and entertainment.
Yeah. So that leads us right into teaching our audience about the agreement struck in the 1920s on the Colorado River. Because
this is just so important. That debate is going on right now.
Yeah, Vegas and Phoenix are very much connected by that agreement.
Yeah, so this is the Colorado River, as probably a lot of your listeners know. This is the main water source for 40 million people between California and the rest of the Southwest. And so it starts in 1920, which is a period when, again, these cities are starting to first grow. There's a lot of agricultural development happening in like the Imperial Valley of California and around Yuma and Arizona. And there's this recognition like California is bigger than the rest of the states the Colorado flows through combined. We have to come up with some kind of plan to manage how the water is going to be shared, because otherwise California is just going to use it up.
Yeah.
And so there's a series of negotiations that kind of culminate in Santa Fe, where there's a delegate selected by each governor of the 7 states, and is overseen by Herbert Hoover at the time, who's like a secretary in that presidential administration. And they hash out the Colorado River Compact, which basically divides the basin into a so-called upper basin and lower basin, where the lower basin is California, Arizona, and Nevada. Upper basin is the state of Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Utah, where the 2 basins split the river 50-50. Maybe a little extra goes to the lower basin because it is a larger existing population. And that's sort of the basic framework for how the river is shared. And then within the state, it's like each state from its half, then they kind of negotiate with each other about who gets what. But that's sort of that is the founding document. The problem with the Colorado River Compact is it was signed after a relatively wet period in the basin. So all of the estimates from the Bureau of Reclamation about the annual flow were off, and off by a lot. And so they're starting by the 50s, everyone knew like, oh, on paper, there is more water than there is in reality. But it's not a huge deal really until the 80s and 90s, because the region just isn't big enough yet.
Sure.
But it's only in the 80s and 90s when, Phoenix crosses the 1 million mark, then the 2 million mark. Las Vegas begins growing really, really rapidly. And then you still have this huge amount of agriculture. And then in 2000, so 2000 is the last time that Lake Mead was full and the other big reservoir, Lake Powell, was full. 2000 starts what's been called like a mega drought, which really since then we have seen the level of these reservoirs drop and drop and drop. And so for the past couple years, we really we have reached the limit of how much water is in the river to be shared. And so I write about in the book kind of the negotiations that are now going off this 1920 document, like how do you use this sort of imperfect agreement to adjust to the current conditions where, as the basin is drying out because of climate change, there's just less and less water available. How do you share in that time of scarcity? Which is like a huge question overhanging all of us.
So Kyle, like as you're telling all these histories and you talk about some of the former sports that were played by the indigenous people and Native Americans that were here. And so like, I was like, if the Martians came back like 10,000 years from now, and they look down at Arizona, or I even say like Nevadans, they say, what was their favorite sport they played? And they'd be like, it was obviously California bashing because they were really good at it. Okay. But here's why I say it, because, and again, I think this says something about the lack of, we've always lived in places of scarcity as Southwesterners. So it's like scarcity doesn't bother us because we live in light of scarcities, to your point. Versus like California, because it was the original settlement in many respects to benefit from the Colorado River, it grew up in abundance, right? Mm-hmm. It didn't grow up in scarcity. And so I point that out because as I read your book, I thought, gosh, New Mexico, even Utah, Nevada, and Arizona, I don't worry about those places because we have to plan. Like Bill said, I think if you, we use less water here in Phoenix today than we did in the 50s because as you talk about in your book, agriculture is coming down, which means as you replace agriculture with single family houses, the use per home is just far less than the same acre of agricultural use. But even down to I want you to touch on this because I have this later in my notes, but I want to put it together with this. You talk about how Vegas used their water resources differently. They use conservation as the main pact, if you will. Versus in a classic, rainfall follows the plow, in a classic free market way, Phoenix just says, you want to use water, you're going to pay the toll for it. And yet they still have been highly efficient. Yeah,
to me, these are kind of the two paths towards using less water, where in Phoenix, it's just starting in 1990, they started charging more for water in the summer.
Correct.
And it's a really, really simple reform that has had a tremendous
Price,
effect.
right?
Yeah,
Price.
the ultimate regulator.
Yep.
Yeah. Whereas in Las Vegas, it's been a little bit more of the stick. There's a little bit of carrot where they
Or
pay
supply
you to
side, like take out your grass and we'll pay you.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a supply side idea.
Yeah.
By the way, it's so ironic. So Cole and I are members at Phoenix Country Club, which of course you got mentioned in the book, which is great. I love walking in there and looking at the original Phoenix Open
history
pictures.
is wonderful. Yeah.
And so there'll be an event at the golf course, and you have to sign up the moment it opens because it fills up almost.
They're rationing it versus just saying, hey, let's pay a market price. Bill and I are like, hey, let's pay market
Cole's
prices.
constantly telling the guys in the pro shop and the member committee, you got to charge a lot more for these events because if somebody wants to play, they should have to pay more.
And you were tugging at my heartstrings because just so you know, like we come from the Northwest. We moved here 5 years ago. I actually graduated high school here in the state of Arizona, so we'd spent some time here before. But I love grass. I will be the first one to tell you, you do not want my water bills in the summer. But you know what? I'm really proud to be able to have the economics to pay those water bills. And you know what? What does that mean? We're going to invest that extra profit I'm giving them into the supply of the future for water. It's all about charging prices to invest for the future, which I find, again, it's rainfall follows the plow.
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing that drives me crazy as a journalist who covers this stuff all the time is every time there's a story about the Colorado River or water scarcity, including stories I've written, the art is usually of a subdivision, right? And often it's a subdivision
housing thing.
Yeah. And 80% of the water in the region goes to agriculture.
I know.
And it's just like, I just think you need to be looking at an alfalfa field in the Imperial Valley.
Well, yeah, that's owned by the
understand.
Saudis that people would tell you about here in Arizona, where the Saudis own the alfalfa field. And it's like, oh, it's a national security and a water crisis. It's like, it's everything wrapped into one, and it's coming from a journalist in Manhattan. And you're like, I don't know if this adds up, but okay, we'll read it, you know?
And so the Imperial Valley uses more watering, or is entitled to more Colorado water than the entire state of Arizona. And I don't want to, pick a fight with the farmers.
But go ahead.
but it's just, there is, to me, if you want to talk about rational water uses, and I have the head of Las Vegas's water authority, John Ensminger, in the book saying we are not going to get into a situation where 40 million people don't have water so that we can keep growing alfalfa, keep growing cotton in the desert. It's just fundamentally irrational. And so to me, yes, residential users should be using less water if they can, but to me, there is actually plenty of water to go around in the region. Yeah. It is just used really inefficiently. It's allocated really inefficiently. And so when people, when I'm talking about the future, I'm not worried about water, actually. Water is a problem we can for sure solve. Yeah. Las Vegas recycles 40% of its wastewater. LA spending $8 billion to do its own version of that program. Phoenix is in an earlier stage of having a water recycling program. There will be water for people who need water.
Well, in Las Vegas, they want you to drink alcohol anyway.
Yeah.
So they don't want people to sit down to dinner and have a glass of water.